Hey guys, Mike with FlightBridgeED. It's October and you know what that means. EMS conferences. Yep, all the big ones. AMTC, EMS World, and of course we're getting ready for Fast 19 in May next year. But to celebrate you, our listeners, FlightBridgeED is offering 20% off of all the courses and books we offer at FlightBridgeED.com. Just use the discount code #FAST. Yes, you have to use the hashtag, so #FAST. Whether you want to pick up the ventilator management book or sign up for the online university or even attend a live course, just use the #FAST when you check out and enjoy that 20% discount. There has never been a better time for you to partner with FlightBridgeED than now. The whole team at FlightBridgeED appreciates your continued support, and we look forward to seeing you at one of these amazing conferences. Take care, guys.
The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and FlightBridgeED in their entirety. This is the FlightBridgeED Podcast, critical care and emergency medicine education for nurses and paramedics. Here's your host, Eric Bauer.
Hey everybody, Eric back with you. Today's podcast is going to be called...
Sam, just lay him in the corner over there. He'll be fine. Is this thing working? Check, 1, 2. Hey guys, welcome back to the FlightBridgeED Podcast. Tyler and Sam from Foam Frat joining you to hijack this episode because we want to talk about something called the mental reset.
Yeah, and sometimes things do not always go according to plan, right, Eric? And that can trip us up, especially if we're in the middle of a resuscitation.
Now, we've all heard about the OODA loop model for decision making. It's a framework. It was designed by John Boyd from the U.S. Air Force. Observe, orient, decide, and act. But how do we reset and assure that this is an actual loop and our mind doesn't get stuck on a missed procedure or some sort of resuscitation hiccup?
Yeah, so today we're going to go over 5 tips that we utilize to jump over that mental barrier or barriers of intra-recess speed bumps.
All right, Sam, why don't you start us off with the first one?
All right, cool. Yeah, so the first one is going to be listing options out loud prior to performing a skill. And so this is like your backup plan that's needed to, for like a shared mental model amongst the crew members. And so the best example that I could actually think of wasn't a specific skill. Maybe you'd call it a skill. But what I was thinking of is when we actually load a critical patient into the ambulance or the helicopter. And, I have my own quick mental checklist that, I've kind of developed over time. But verbally, I actually like to go from A through E out loud with whoever my partner is in the back. And so, if we have an intubated patient, I'll start with A and I'll say, okay, after movement and everything, looks like the ET tube is still secure. Waveform looks good on the end title. B, I've already tailored the vent settings at this point, and it's connected to onboard oxygen. SpO2 and end title look good. The map looks good for C, and, we have a good pleth wave. The 12 lead is printed. Have we actually looked at it? D, seems like the patient's going to need a little bit more sedation. And I've noticed that when you state your plan out loud, it kind of resets everything, and you can be sure that whatever you've accomplished up to this point is pretty solid. And then that kind of gives you your orientation of the OODA loop. So you've observed everything that's happening and you're oriented to what's happening right now with the patient. And then you can decide on your next action and then actually make an informed decision on that and act on it.
This model and sharing this out with everybody prevents you from getting tunnel vision and you from getting task saturated on one thing. But it also does something else. It lets you know that this is not a one and done situation. If you do not get that intubation, there are options. There are supraglottic airways. There is a BVM, and that kind of relaxes you a little bit. I know it does for me, especially when starting an IV. If I'm starting an IV, I can think to myself, all right, if I need to, I can give intranasal medication. I can start an IO if I need. Thank God that helps us out so much. And so I just like sharing this out loud because not only does it let everybody on the crew know exactly what you're thinking, but it also allows you to relax a little bit and recognize your options.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so I think that feeds really well into our next point. And Tyler, why don't you take this one? So it's going to be, how do you incorporate failed, IVs, IOs, intubations, like into your simulation? How does that help and feed into an OODA loop?
Yeah, so I notice during simulations here at LifeLink, you would say, all right, I'm going to start an IV. And then they would say, you don't get the IV. And you're like, all right, I don't. Nope, you can't get IV access. And they wanted to see how well you troubleshoot. How do you work your way down that framework when you have a small little hiccup? Or you grab your IV pump and, oh, the battery's dead on that pump. Little things like this are huge for simulation, because if your simulation always goes perfectly, you get the tube on the first try, you don't have any can't intubate, can't ventilate, can't oxygenate scenarios, then you're always going to feel like, if that comes across in real life, that you're not successful with that. So if you simulate these things, then it's just always part of the routine to say, well, if I don't get this, I can really quick snap out of it, reset, and come up with my backup plan.
Yeah, that's good. And you know what? Speaking of backup plans, you think we should move on to the next point?
Yeah. So what is number 3, Sam? Partner support. How can the partner really be a strong asset?
Yeah, so the partner is the one that's mostly going to be watching you do one of these procedures. But let's take airway for example. Hopefully you have an airway assistant. And if that airway assistant is sitting there saying, "Hey, did you see the cords? How come the tube won't advance?" and all this different kind of stuff, putting pressure on you for only plan A, that's not really constructive. And some people will say throwing that out of your loop. You've been thrown out of your loop. And that means that, you had an orientation, you decided to make a plan, and when you went to act on that plan after you decided, it didn't work out exactly the way that you wanted it to. And so now you've got to observe what the problem is. But in this case, somebody else is also helping you observe what the problem is. In fact, they're making it very plain what the problem is. But what you want instead is for somebody to say, hey, you know what, it's not a problem. This is the situation that we're in right now. We've exhausted A. Well, we still have B and C. And so why don't we try those next? And, in the case of airway, why don't we reoxygenate for a little bit, and then we'll go to our backup airway.
Now, I think that as a partner, if you see that your colleague is having a hard time starting that IV or a hard time getting that tube, it's important that you try to provide self-positive talk. And I think that's what we're talking about right here, is allowing them to feel comfortable, relaxed, and tell them, listen, if all right, man, you didn't get, it's probably a tough airway. Let's go to a supraglottic airway. You're the voice of reason, because they're going to be beating themselves up for not getting that tube or not getting that IV. And it's up to you to make sure that they carry on that resus and they're able to reset that OODA loop. All right. So moving on to the next one is knowing your equipment inside and out. Now, here's why. We are all going to have equipment failures. We're going to have IV pumps that like to alarm. We are going to have vent circuits that say that there's some sort of issue. We have low pressure alarms, high pressure alarms. All of these things are going to happen, but it's how we're able to troubleshoot these that really makes a difference. And in order to be able to troubleshoot these effectively, you need to be able to recreate all of these issues. And so one of the things that I've been doing as newer people come through orientation here at LifeLink is we go upstairs and we set up the airway mannequin. And one of the first things I do is I put the tube in. I said, all right, you're coming in for an interfacility transport. I'm bagging the patient. And I tell them we just intubated. And they're going to switch them over to the vent. And when they switch them over to the vent, they get a low pressure alarm or they get a circuit disconnect. And so they go, oh, I'm sorry, we're going to disconnect the circuit, put the patient back on the BVM. And they're trying to figure out where their circuit is leaking. And they put it back on the ET tube and it says it's leaking again. And then finally something clicks and they go, you know what, is that cuff inflated on the ET tube? Now, this is a situation where if you've never had that before, you could run circles around trying to figure out why you're getting these low pressure or circuit disconnect alarms. But once you get that mental model and you've troubleshot and you've played with these scenarios, and you build up exactly your process for troubleshooting, starting from the patient and working your way back to the ventilator, that's when all of a sudden you have this recognition prime decision making. You recognize the problem and you decide exactly what to do.
And Tyler, you just did that podcast on the debate with Winchell and Perlmutter about the pump alarms, the IV pump alarms. And I really think that you and I are like the only ones who truly love that Alaris 3-channel pump. But I think it's probably because both of us have literally read the entire instruction manual, which it actually isn't very big at all, but it sounds really impressive if you say you've read the entire thing.
No, exactly. You look at guys in the military and they have to take apart their gun and put it back together, and they have to know how to troubleshoot everything on that gun, because if you're in battle and you can't get your gun working, you're screwed, because that is your security. And so when we're taking care of a patient, the ventilator, the pumps, those are things that are keeping them alive. And it's up to us, and it's our responsibility to be able to troubleshoot anything that comes along.
Yeah, one that especially comes to mind with the IV pumps, because I know a lot of people work with these Alaris 3-channel pumps, is that fluid side occlusion alarm. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Absolutely.
It's the one where you have to press the alarm, and then you have to actually sit there, and you have to have, at least once have taken the time to read exactly what the screen says, so that instead of like going back to the home screen, you actually have to press like confirm and then start again, and it comes with the little check mark. When I show people that, even people who've been working with these pumps for like years and years, they act like it's the greatest thing they've ever heard of in their entire life, because people, they get in this mode, and that's what we're actually going to talk about next here. They observe something and they pretty much go straight to act, kind of almost skipping those middle steps.
How do we identify if we're messing up the OODA loop and we're not hitting all the processes? And I thought this was a really good point when you brought this up earlier, Sam.
Yeah, so this is kind of like when you have no recollection of the decision-making process. And so I kind of, instead of like a loop, I almost think of this almost as like a game of ping pong. One paddle is observe and the other paddle is act. And you're the ping pong ball, and you're just getting slapped back and forth between these two. Now, I do want to make a caveat that there is a point where you're very familiar with the situation. So, for example, I'll go back to that IV pump alarm. When I see fluid side occluded, I'll check the line real quick. But I mean, 99% of the time, because of my own experience, because of my orientation and the things that I've been through with these pumps, I know immediately how to correct this thing. And so I kind of skip that whole decision part because I know exactly how I'm going to act. So there is a space for people who are experienced in certain things where they kind of go, oh, I observe that, and they need very little orientation because they are the orientation. They are the person that they are, and they've had their own experiences. And so they can act on those very quickly, pretty much without going through a decision-making process. But here's where the actual problem comes in. When you go from observe and you have kind of a distorted orientation. And so this would be, if you haven't been in a situation before, if you don't remember how the last situation turns out, just anything that would kind of make you unfamiliar, unsure, whatever the case might be, it's kind of like almost going in blind. You have a distorted orientation, and without a good orientation, you can't really make a good informed decision. And so you go observe, some kind of distorted orientation, quickly to act. And then, of course, since it's a loop, that act comes back around to you observing the side effects of that bad action. And so then the whole process can just start to repeat itself and turn itself into kind of a faulty OODA loop, all because of that bad orientation.
That's a great point. The OODA loop is a system one process. It's the ability to not really have to think much about a decision and spring right to action, exactly like you're describing. So we have to be extremely careful. If we get hung up on a repeated loop during resuscitation, we're trying to get an IV, we can't get a nice clean 12 lead. We're trying to get patient intubated. Any of these things can cause us to get completely task saturated. And we got to practice the ability to step back, reset, and talk out loud. Say exactly what you're thinking. If you're going to intubate the patient, say out loud exactly what you're seeing. So that way your partner, who's that 90% ready diver, as they put it in rescue diving, they always have a diver that's in the water, and then they have one that's at 90%, which means he is ready to go in at any time. That second intubator that is going to come in if you can't hit that tube is the 90% diver. And you need to let them know what you see as you went in. And so that way they have a chance of being successful as well.
I think that's a really good point about calling out the landmarks, basically, as you were pointing out on that intubation checklist podcast or vodcast that I did a little bit ago. That was like a huge part to try to teach people when, teaching them how to use that checklist was, progressive laryngoscopy, note all of the landmarks as you go down, and so that everybody knows, because everybody's attention is on this procedure inside of the room, or in the helicopter or the ambulance, wherever you are, everybody's attention is on this. And so by updating everybody in the room continually, going down the tongue, okay, yep, I can see these structures, okay, the bougie's in, I'm having some trouble passing the tube. And then, your partner, if they're also airway trained and, you're newer at the airway and you're still stuck on the cords, I can't advance the tube. They're going to know exactly where you are in the process instead of wondering, hey, why are you struggling? And they'll tell you, hey, just give that thing a quick counterclockwise turn and you'll be able to pass the tube past those cartilages. So really important to let everybody know exactly where you're at in your procedure.
All right. So as we sum this up, I want to say that this is something that happens to everybody. We want to be perfect. We want to be completely flawless when it comes to resuscitation. And we do have calls that go that way, but we also have calls that don't. And what's important is how we react to those calls. I remember right off the bat when I first started working at LifeLink, I showed up to one of my first shifts. I would always get here an hour early. One day I got here 30 minutes early instead of an hour. And right as I got here, the helicopter was leaving. And I felt horrible because as a new employee, as an orientee, you don't want to miss a flight. That's not good. One of the nurses that was coming on shift said, you know what? Not a big deal, man. You need to completely reset your brain because you have an entire shift. Don't let that get to you. And I think that's so important, is to not let it get to us. Realize that there is a backup plan and be able to reset that OODA loop and maintain the loop and not get hung up in a repetitive, task-saturated process. You have anything you want to add, Sam, before we head out?
Well, I don't, but I was just going to ask Eric if he had anything. Well, hopefully he can reset his OODA loop after this.
All right. He looks like he's starting to come conscious again. Let's get out of here.
This has been a production of the FlightBridgeED Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education.